Welcome to Theology for the People. My name is Nick Cady, and the purpose of this podcast is to bring theological topics and discussions to you in a way that's understandable and engaging. My guest on this episode is Jen Wilkin. She is a speaker and author, and she has recently written a book called Dust to Dust, Aging Wisely in an Anti-Aging World. And really the topic of aging is interesting. It's not a topic that's discussed a lot in our common discourse about the Bible or in churches, but it is something that we all experience, and actually experiencing it is a gift, as we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how aging itself is not a result of the fall, but something that was designed by God, and how God designed us to develop over time. The fall has caused us to decline over time. So how do we process that? How do we think about that in a Christian and biblical way? For me, I became a pastor very young, and so for many years, I was the youngest person in a lot of the circles that I moved in, but that has recently changed. I'm no longer the youngest person, and there are people under me. I've gained some wisdom, I hope, to be able to share with others, and so I'm stepping into a new season, but also all of us, if we have the gift of being able to live long enough, then we will age. And how do we do so biblically? How do we value those who are a couple steps ahead of us? And how do those who are, if that's you, a couple steps ahead, how can you see the value in what you possess and how you can contribute to the body of Christ with the wisdom that you've gained over the years? So it's a great discussion, wonderful topic. I hope you'll benefit from it. And if you like this video, give it a like, share with somebody else who you think will benefit from it. I'll be back at the end with some closing thoughts. Here's my discussion with Jen Wilkin. Well, Jen, thank you so much for being a guest on Theology for the People.
Thanks so much for having me on.
For our listeners who might be meeting you for the first time, would you please just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your journey in life and ministry, and then we'll delve into your book.
Great. I am a wife to Jeff. We've been married for 33 years. I have 5 children. I have 7 grandchildren, which is just inexplicable to me. I'm 57 years old, so that feels like too many, but only 2 of our 5 kids have produced those. So who knows what it's going to look like in a few years, but it's a great problem. It's not a problem. It's a great opportunity to have at this stage of life. I have done ministry among women for about 30 years. And my main drumbeat is Bible literacy. And so what we'll be talking about today is a little bit off the beaten path for me. But I think because I've spent so much time doing ministry among women, it was also something that was top of mind for me to talk about. I worked on a church staff for a long time and have gone into, I wouldn't call it retirement. My husband says I got rid of 3 jobs and now just have 2. So I currently spend my time doing things to train the church into how to restore learning environments to its spaces to address both the biblical and the theological illiteracy crisis that the church finds itself in. And I write line-by-line Bible studies, and occasionally a book falls out of me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So are you in Texas?
Yes, I am. I'm outside of Dallas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are you?
I'm in Boulder, Colorado. Longmont, Colorado, for those who know, but we're right outside of Boulder.
Yeah, I don't need to hear about how nice the weather is there right now.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like where you are, but it's pretty nice.
It's 106 right now. So
yeah, definitely not experiencing that right now.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, before we go any further, you just were telling me offline that you had an accident kind of similar to my accident. So is there anything that you've reflected on since your accident that would be noteworthy?
There have been so many things. I went from, my son, Matt, through a series of events involving natural birth and adoption, has 4 children under the age of 3.5. And so I had been actively helping with caregiving for them while they were getting through the infant phase and all of that. And went from that to, with one wrong step on a European vacation to being the one who needed care all the time. And it's the Lord's sense of humor that on the day that my book on aging released, I was in a wheelchair and using a walker to get around. And so really, even at my newest grandchild's adoption ceremony, I sat in a wheelchair next to my 86-year-old dad who was in a wheelchair, and we held hands the whole time. And so, I was saying to you before we got on here, and I truly believe it, these early encounters that we have with some form of disability or illness to me, they're a litmus test of how my heart is going to face the great gift and trial that aging to an extreme age can be.
Yeah, I tell this to people in my church all the time because they'll ask me like, "How do you feel about being disabled?" Because
Yeah.
I actually got registered this year as like permanently disabled.
Yeah.
And
And how old are you, Nick?
I'm 43. My
Okay.
accident happened when I was 40. Actually, maybe 39. Yeah, it was before my
Wow.
birthday. So yeah,
Okay.
39. I got
Wow.
injured.
Welcome to your 40s.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And what I tell people is like, if you live long enough, which
Yes.
it's a gift to live a long life.
Yeah.
But if you live long enough, we're all going to be disabled, man.
That's right.
It's just a
You're
matter
exactly
of time
right.
and what kind of disability you're going to have. And so for me, yeah, it's caused a lot of reflection on the nature of life and aging. And I do want to talk to you about that. But before we do, I was intrigued by what you said about biblical literacy. And I was wondering if maybe you could just give us a little bit on that.
Oh, yeah. I could give you hours on it. So it's no secret, probably to anyone listening, that we are in a general literacy crisis. Like in many ways, our culture is moving into a post-literate phase. And I actually would say one of the indicators we see of this is how you're seeing Christians return to more traditional forms of worship that are more icon-driven, more driven by appeals to all five senses. If you think about it, the OG of those spaces, the Catholic Church, developed all of its multisensory approaches to knowing your faith during a pre-literate phase of the culture. And so it is not surprising to me that in what is increasingly a post-literate phase, you see people flocking back to those traditions. We don't want to read anything, much less the Bible. We actually have more access to the Bible itself and to what people say about the Bible than any other generation previously has had. And yet, at best, what all of the statistics are showing us is that most of us can only be called connoisseurs of other people's opinions about a book that we ourselves don't actually know or trouble to read. And so when I talk about Bible literacy, there are two pieces: Bible literacy and Bible fluency. Bible literacy is the first stop on the road to Bible fluency. Bible literacy is knowing what the Bible says, being able to say, this is the big story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Like I'll often say to people, could you tell that big story in 5 minutes or less? And then Bible literacy is knowing things like, what are the 10 commandments? What order are they in? Who were the 12 disciples? Like very simple things that most people would say, well, those don't really matter. But when you know that what the Bible is mostly doing is repeating itself over and over again, it becomes critical for us to be able to observe those patterns to actually know what it says. And so then by contrast, Bible fluency, which would be the goal for all of us, is, well, let me put it in terms that anyone who's ever learned a foreign language would understand. You know you're fluent in a foreign language when you start to, what? Dream in it.
Dream in
Yeah,
it.
dream in it. And so what I want to see a generation of Bible readers do is become a generation that knows how to dream in Bible. So in other words, we know how to fully inhabit the symbolic universe of the Bible. We understand how the Bible is using words and images in a consistent and coherent way across 66 books.
Yeah, that's great. So,
Yeah.
and you've written some, you said line by line Bible studies, and I'm sure those are available.
Yes, I do studies over entire books of the Bible from start to finish. And that's on purpose. Most people have a steady diet of either devotional content or topical content. And so they have only a piecemeal spot knowledge of the scripture. And I promise you, you're never going to read a devotional written over the book of Leviticus. So you're getting a very curated version of the Bible if that's where you're going most of the time for your quote, time in the Word.
Sure. All right. Well, one thing I noticed that you said earlier when you're introducing yourself is that you told us all your age. And
Yes.
I think that is rare. And I bet it was on purpose. And so I would be curious to know from you why that is. Why did you do that? And
so, yeah, I would love to tell you that that's something I started doing as a bit for launching the book, but I've actually done it for as long as I can remember, because when you're in all female spaces in particular, you learn pretty quickly that we're supposed to fear aging and we're supposed to conceal it. And so the whole quote market for anti-aging products or messages is based on cultivating a deep and abiding fear in us of what it means to look old and what it means to be old. And so one of the ways that I just decided I wasn't going to opt in was that I wasn't going to conceal my age. The funny thing is no one's allowed to ask, right? Even if I'm willing to tell it. It's funny, I've been doing interviews for the book and people are always like, well, can I ask your age? It's like, yes, we should be able to tell each other that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that ties in with your book. So the book is called, I got a copy of it here. So it's called Dust to Dust, and it's about aging wisely in an anti-aging world. So maybe just start off by telling us, what false story does our culture tell us about aging, and what is the different story that Scripture invites us to believe?
So there is a famous quote that's variously attributed that says, "He who tells the best story wins." And so the question you should always be asking yourself is, who's telling the most compelling story right now? And then, is it a true story? The anti-aging story is so saturated in our culture that it funds or supports the funding of a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think the number for last year was $77 billion, and that number is supposed to double in the next 10 years. That's just in the United States. So whatever this false story is, it's generating a great deal of fear very successfully. And you know how they'll say in any scandal, follow the money? Well, I would say follow the money on this one. You know what's not funded to the tune of $77 billion a year? The American church. So what is it that that even Christians are taking in? There's a question of what the culture is saying. And that's what the church is typically saying, oh, the culture is wrong. But my greater interest is in how has the message that the culture is saying crept into the church, sometimes without us even being aware. And I see that there is very little distinction in the way that people think about aging between non-Christians and Christians. The false story of the world says that to age is to become obsolete. If you look at the typical ministry structures of the local church, does the way that we think about the elderly communicate that we see them as essential and indispensable to the life of the church, or that we view them as essentially just waiting to die? And then, we think about how we support pro-life issues at the abortion center. Do we see people in nursing homes and assisted living facilities to the same degree that we see them advocating for beginning of life, pro-life issues? So there are issues within the church, and then there are issues at a personal level. I have seen so many Christian women with a platform say, well, I'm not going to, do anything to conceal my aging, but listen, it's a personal decision. You do you. And I hear often, well, if death is a result of the fall and we're supposed to do everything we can to war against death, then aging would fall into that same category. So, and obviously this looks different for men and women. Some things are the same, some things are different. But I think the mindset that how you age is your own personal decision is one that has been taken from a culture of radical autonomy and expressive individualism and been transported into the church, because I think pulpits are largely silent on this issue. It's one of the reasons I ended up writing the book. What do you think? Have you heard sermons on this?
I have not heard a lot of sermons on it. Just anecdotally, I have so many things that happened last week that kind of like tie into this topic, though.
Oh, yeah?
So I read your book. I was on a flight to a conference. I went to a conference this past weekend, and I took with us our 2 pastoral interns that we have at our church. And I was just traveling with them. They're in their 20s, and I'm in my 40s. And so I caught myself. So on the one hand, I have a lot of things to say that I want to ask you about your book.
Yeah.
But I also picked up on things, probably because I was reading it, that I thought were interesting. One of them was that, I'm 20 years older than these guys. And I found myself, we were in Southern California. And so I found myself like pointing out to them things, how it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And almost being a little bit embarrassed about the
You're
fact
the old
that
dude talking about the good old days.
the old guy. Yeah, totally. But then the irony was that then they were asking me a lot of questions about ministry. And I spent 10 years, I was a pastor in Hungary. I speak Hungarian, and I learned, the culture by living there. They were asking me what's different about ministry in Hungary. And I said, the first thing that really stood out to me, because I moved there and I was pastoring in my 20s, was that they don't worship youth to the same degree that we do. Like, we're pretty extreme with it in our culture, to the point where we actually, and you say this in your book, that in our culture, we often think or say that wisdom is with the young, which is so kind of backwards of like even facts. But it's really true. Like, I know so many churches where they'll be like, well, we're going to do this thing, but you know what we need to do? We need to have like a panel that we can bounce this off of young people to get their wisdom on this.
Right.
And I do understand why that might be smart to do, but also, like, what is that saying about us culturally? And do we even realize the water that we're swimming in?
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, here's the other funny thing that happened. Then the person who filled in for me and on my pulpit is a retired pastor in my church. And I believe he's 84 years old.
Nice.
And he did a fantastic job. But, several times in his message, because I listened to it afterwards, he references the fact that he's old, and he's probably never going to preach here again and things like that. And, even there was a bit of thought, if not trepidation on my part, like, is it a good idea to have an 84-year-old speak,
Right.
And I kind of came to the conclusion that actually, yes, we don't want to, I think that would be the wrong thing to do, to say because he's older, therefore he's disqualified from the pulpit because we got to put up somebody, who's young and hip and energetic or whatever.
Right.
And he has something to contribute as well. So any thoughts on that before I get into one of my questions about your book?
Yeah, it's tricky because, I think if there is a sin of seeker-sensitive ministry that is occurring today, like, I think everybody can look back and be like, oh, yeah, Willow Creek model, whatever. We don't do that anymore, blah, blah, blah. But we do tend to be intuitively seeker-sensitive of attracting the young. And I can understand, like, the ministry justification of like, well, I mean, we need the church to continue on for years and we need to raise up the next generation. But I think you have to season that with, how do we raise up the next generation? We raise up the next generation by giving them proximity to the generation that preceded us. One generation will tell the next of the wonderful works of the Lord. And the way that tale is told by an 84-year-old is different, substantively, qualitatively more wise than the way it will be told by you in your 40s. And it doesn't mean that you don't have wisdom for a 43-year-old guy. It just means that this guy who preached at your church last Sunday, he has 41 more years of watching the patterns repeat. The things that are starting to be intuitive for you are grounded in cement for him. But since we live in a culture that, where we all have drawers full of old tech that is obsolete and unusable anymore, we have a top of mind sense of obsolescence that previous generations just didn't have. And we can be guilty of assigning that to humans, not just to objects.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So there were two things that really stood out to me from your book that I found really interesting, maybe a third. The first one
is two. Come on, man.
Well, these are the top three, let's say. The first one was I was fascinated by your structure, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but the chiasm structure that you used. The other thing, though, and this is where I want to start, is that you actually start by talking about the fall in the introduction. And you say that the fall has changed aging from, I think it was something about growing in wisdom to now actually like moving towards death. So could you start us out there and share how has the fall affected this?
Well, I think an important realization for me in understanding aging was that aging is not something that is a consequence of the fall. Aging is something that happened pre-fall. And the way we know that is because the creation account in Genesis 1 gives us timestamps on each day of creation. It says, and there was evening and there was morning the next day. So we understand that when the creation account begins, the passage of time is functioning. And then the next piece that we need to see is that when God gives the cultural mandate, when he tells both the animals and the humans to be fruitful and multiply, what's implied there is that they would bear babies who would grow to maturity. And so we were supposed to grow and change with the passage of time. Now, that's about all I would dare to speculate about what aging was supposed to be like before the fall, other than to say that we wouldn't see the division that we see now of your body, which peaks at midlife and then begins into a decline, and your soul or your interior life that continues on a curve up and to the right. So, the statement I use in the book is bodies decline, people develop. In other words, your body is wasting away, but inwardly you're being transformed from glory to glory. That's the way that the New Testament would say it. Now, for the believer, obviously, there is a particular quality and kind of depth personally that is happening that you wouldn't see among the unbeliever. But most of us know an unbeliever who has wisdom that is the product of age that we've sought out, even though they're not a Christ follower. I know people like that. So there is something of this that's true for every human. I think it is particularly true for those who are in Christ that we see deepening and richening of the interior life the more years that are granted to us, or at least that is what we should be expecting to see. So pre-fall, we would have seen our bodies, I assume, enriching and improving as time passed. But post-fall, we see our bodies follow a different curve than our souls do.
Yeah, that's really good. So the structure I was referring to earlier is that you see a chiasm in life where the outward parts of the chiasm, if anybody doesn't know, maybe you could explain it to us, but the outward parts kind of like parallel each other as you go towards the part that's almost like the tip of an arrow pointing to something.
Yeah.
And that structure helps us see parallels, but also it helps us to see the focus of something.
That's right.
I've heard it said that theologians, they love chiasms. Like they find chiasms under every bush.
It's like,
right?
where's Waldo? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But tell us about this chiasm. And what is a chiasm? And talk about it.
Yeah, I think some theologians are too highbrow for them. I find that people like me generally love them. The people in the cheap seats really love them. But so my theological training has been, by hook or by crook. But my degree was in English. And so I do understand language. I understand genre and writing and all those kinds of things. And so the chiasm, I think, appeals to me both as a teacher who wants sticky learning outcomes and then also as someone who expects there to be structure in things that I read. So in the Bible, these chiastic structures, an easy example that most people can pick up on, how like you're reading sometimes and you're like, I feel like I just read that. Why are we saying that again? You're probably bumping into the bookends of one of these structures. And so Psalm 139 starts with, Lord, you have searched me and known me. And it ends with, search me and know me, O God. And so, So then if you pay attention, you can start to map inward these parallel ideas. In Western literature, we're accustomed to an end stress. We like the punchline on a joke or the moral of a story, but the ancient Near Eastern mind loved to place that stress point at the middle. And so I just began to ask, why are these so popular in Scripture? I think one of the reasons is because it was an oral tradition for the most part, the way that people received the words of Scripture. And so these are memory hooks. They're the kindness of God to people who might never hold a copy of the Bible in their hands to help them remember what they're learning. But I also think that it's because they're telling us something about the shape of a human life. It's an easily recognizable shape for us and the correspondences. So, we have a phrase, when you're past midlife, we say that you are over the hill, right? We understand intuitively that life follows this shape. It would be like the chiasm shape turned on its side. It has a midpoint. But I think what we can sometimes miss is that there are these corresponding parallels on either side of that midpoint. So just for example, this started to come clear for me at the death of my mother because I sat at her bedside. She died at my house. She was in hospice care there for about 10 days. And the hospice nurse said, you can coach her through this. And there's my mother lying there. She's having labored breathing, like the sheer work it takes to die is something that anyone who's ever sat at the bedside of someone who was dying can attest to. It is a labor, and it can be helped by coaching. And it concludes with this giant exhale and a crashing silence. And in the weeks that followed my mother's passing, I just couldn't shake the correspondence to the beginning of life, where there is a labor that ends with a giant inhale and a massive wail that is the sign of life. So I just got curious and started mapping things inward. And, it's funny. Some of the correspondences are kind of funny. Like a teenager can't wait to get his driver's license. A senior adult is afraid he's going to lose it. You've got toddlers. I tell in the book the story of how there was a day where I got a text that my grandson was walking without falling anymore. And then the next text I got was my stepmother saying, "Your dad fell again." And so, we know in pieces that these things are happening. I wanted to pull it all into one place for our consideration, because I think that's how we learn to number our days, to borrow from Psalm 90.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I've got it in front of me. So you have them labeled, right? So your A is birth, and that corresponds to death, right? Like you said, the after labor, an inhale versus a final exhale. Then you've got like the first years and how they correspond to the final years, adolescence and senior adulthood. And then you get into early adulthood, which is characterized by caregiving for children, and late midlife, which is characterized by caregiving for parents. And then you say that really the point of the arrow, if you will, is midlife, which you call the place of perspective. Could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're someone who's there right now. I think I could no longer fairly claim to be in midlife. And I would argue that if you're a good student of the layers that brought you to the middle, you will be able to be a better executor of exiting the structure. So I borrow in the book from the words of Job, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. So you hear those two parallels. And then what does he say next? He says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In physical terms, and in some degree, cognitive terms, the first half of the curve is the Lord giving. And the second half of the curve is the Lord taking away. And the question will be, can we say on both sides of the curve, blessed be the name of the Lord? Do we actually believe that the second half of life contains as much or potentially even more richness than the first half of life? And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book before I was officially geriatric, because I didn't want to write it as someone trying to justify where I already was in life. I wanted to write it as someone looking toward that phase and trying to learn from the people I love most who are in that phase of life. Because, you'll read books about the elderly written by the elderly that sound like, no, really, things are still valuable. And I think those are genuine and good things that bring the elderly a lot of comfort. But I think that the young are like, I'll read that book when I get there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. As I have reached midlife, one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of people, at this stage of life, like there's all these jokes, right? Like I took up road cycling, which a lot of people do. And that's a better option than like divorcing your wife and buying a sports car.
Yes. Much prefer that one.
A lot of people have these midlife crises.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? And then why is midlife for some people a season of disorientation as opposed to a season of like having good perspective? And so how can we best navigate it?
I actually don't mind that it's a season of disorientation. I think that it's probably the first time for many people to assess their mortality if they haven't had a brush with death earlier in life. They start to think, wait a minute, if you double my age, it's a number that I'm not going to get to. And so I don't mind the midlife crisis. I think it takes some really unhealthy forms, because the way that we gauge whether our life has gotten us where we want to be at that stage is often gauged in very worldly terms. It has to do with, am I where I want to be in my career, or where I want to be with like I don't know how many kids I had or whether my kids are succeeding. We have a lot of success markers that are just less important than others. But I do think it's you'd be crazy not to assess things at the midpoint. But then again, the way that people react often reveals a lot about how much soul work they've done heading into the middle than other points in life may have done.
Yeah. When it comes to like losing independence as someone moves down the chiasm, exits that, as you put it, like what would the biblical perspective be, for somebody who finds themselves losing independence and having to become more dependent on someone?
Well, I think that the way that our culture thinks about being human goes a little bit like this. I grow to independence in young adulthood, and then I am supposed to remain independent until I die, or I have failed. I've done something wrong. And one of the ways that I see this play out is like in my parents' generation, the worst thing they could imagine was that they would be, quote, a burden to us, to their adult children. And the burden language gives it away, right? Because it means that they are an unwelcome, unanticipated interruption to our otherwise self-determined path in life. And this way of looking at things is foreign to many other cultures that are contemporary to ours today, but it is entirely foreign to the world to which the Bible was written, to ancient Israel, when the fifth command is given to honor father and mother. I like to remind people that the 10 Commandments are primarily focused not to children, but to adults. You shall not murder is a very adult thing to tell someone. And so honor your father and mother, we think of it as something you tell your 5-year-old when they're disobeying. But the real thrust of that command is to adult children, that their parents are deserving of honor into their later years. And part of the honor that's implicit there is that they would receive care from you so that their care doesn't become actually burdensome to someone else. Now think about that. In Israel's day and age, there's not an assisted living facility. There's not a nursing home. And so we do have care options available to us that wouldn't have been available to ancient Israel. But the reason that the elderly conceive themselves as a burden is because of our very Western first world idea that your aging is your responsibility, and that adult children should not have to be inconvenienced or interrupted by the aging needs of their parents. Whereas in most cultures in human history, people looked toward end of life care as an expectation and a duty and an honor. So when I say that care for the elderly should not be burdensome, what I'm not saying is that it should be easy. But I'm saying that the language of burden implies that someone failed along the way, and now we're having to take up the slack for them. Instead of recognizing that if you receive the gift of long life, you will also, with that, face a return to dependency, which will do the good work of sanctification in you the way that every other trial in your life has.
Wow. Well, about 5-6 years ago, our church received a group of about 80 senior adults.
Oh my
And
gosh.
They all showed up together, kind of like they weren't all from the same place.
Were they on the run, or were they like, what's the deal?
There was some changes in leadership at a couple of churches around
Yeah.
here, and those churches very much made it clear that they were canceling all of the older adult programming. So a lot of these older people, they had been around town, they knew each other and stuff. And so they all kind of trickled into our church until there were about 80 of them in total. And, prior to that, our church had been primarily, maybe exclusively, young people, meaning like younger families.
Yeah.
And so they came and we welcomed them. But I do remember, especially in the beginning, that many of them would say to me or to other people on staff, they would say, "We're so sorry that we came in and changed your church. And we're so sorry that, if you don't want us here, we can leave.
Yeah.
And, I definitely got the impression that they viewed themselves as a burden, and not just that, but they had been kind of treated that way. As if, like you said, it's time to do spring cleaning and we got to throw out the old electronics.
Yeah.
And definitely, the places they had come from, 2 places in particular, had really communicated like, we are going for the next generation. You're not part of that.
Yeah.
So you're welcome to stay, but we are not going to be doing anything for you.
Yeah.
And I know that was hurtful to them, but, we were actually kind of like really happy to have them, not just because they were, more people attending services, but that they were the kind of demographic we had never had before. We had never really had, that. And so we have certainly enjoyed having them, but just what you're saying, the idea of being viewed as, and even them, I guess, internalizing that, right? That I am a burden, we are a burden. What responsibilities would you say churches have towards older believers, and how can we move beyond just caring for them to also, mutually receiving from them?
Yeah, discipleship is lifelong. You don't stop being discipled at a certain age. And it doesn't mean that I also want to emphasize that there is a form of downward discipleship that we can only receive from people who are our superiors in age and wisdom, to borrow from the Westminster Catechism's rewording of the fifth command. And so I think that the way that we need to learn to see this is to recall something that is just dramatically missing from our understanding of the doctrine of the church in this day and age. And that is that the church is the family of God. And these elderly people in our midst are our spiritual mothers and fathers. And so often we perceive the spiritual mothers and fathers in our churches to be people about your age, Nick. And it's not that you don't have a fatherly role to play in your church with those who are younger than you, but you think about Paul's words where he says, treat older men as fathers, treat older women as mothers. That's spoken to a young leader. And so you want to honor your father and mother, not because it's just a duty that you're supposed to check off the list, but because in honoring them, there is this reciprocal blessing that happens. We don't want to do things for the blessing, but we'd be dumb not to recognize that there is one, right?
Yeah.
But we don't recognize it. We think that all we can do is serve that population. We think there is no reciprocal service that they will provide to us. And so, I think that what churches owe to that generation of believers is not just, hey, we're going to have a senior adult ministry for you, any more than I want you to just have a student ministry that basically functions as a church within its church, within a church. How are we? And it's not wrong to have those spaces. I want to be clear, but it's wrong to only have those spaces or to create those spaces in such a way that they don't create flow between the generations. Part of what needs to happen is that older population needs to be encouraged and equipped to have ways to reach out to the younger generation that feel doable. So one of the things we'll say is like, well, just mentor these people. Well, mentor these people can be a very nebulous instruction. People, in my experience, do better with all ministry offerings when it's well-defined, when it has on-ramps and off-ramps. So like, what if it was like, hey, go have 3 coffees with this person? Because the best mentorships are just friendships between generations. So see if you want to be friends with this person. But churches are often, they've stopped finding strategic ways to connect, not just younger people to older people, but older people to younger people. The older people feel either like they are not seen at all or like they have a target painted on them, and 45 younger people are going to say, will you mentor me? And what they mean is, can I just grab wisdom from you whenever I want it, but not actually have a relationship with you where we're friends?
Wow.
So I would argue our familial language in the church is, in general, it's atrophied. We only think that men can be friends with men and women can be friends with women. We only think that teenagers can be friends with teenagers and elderly people can be friends with elderly people, and so on and so forth. But when you think about the healthiest families everyone has a deep and abiding affection for everyone else. So that's what we want within the church.
Yeah. A lot of people struggle emotionally with the changes that aging brings to their
Yeah.
appearance and their physical ability.
Mm-hmm.
How can Christians honestly kind of grieve those losses? Because I think there's a bit of grief involved.
Mm-hmm.
How can we do that well, without allowing like youth and productivity and all these sorts of things to determine our worth?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think there's how the individual processes it. I think there's also how that, if I'm understanding you correctly, how the child with the aging parent is processing the aging parent's aging, because sometimes we can miss it, right? Like
Mm,
we're so used to our parents being our parents that we miss the turn. And I would correspond that to with raising young children. There's a pivotal moment that you have to be looking for and ease into when you move from being the director to the consultant, right? Where
mhm,
you're like, you become, well, how can I help you get to where you need to be versus me telling you what to do? And I think what can happen on the other side of this, because these correspondences are same but different, is the way I talk about them in the book, is you're accustomed to your parent being fully in charge, but they've moved back into a phase of needing you as a consultant. But what we do is we skip right from consultant to, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do.
mm,
You know what, mom and dad, this home is not safe for you anymore. So I'm going to make sure that we get you somewhere safe.
mm,
And your parents are like, hang on. We're full grown adults. We're not a child, and our wants and our needs and our quality of life need to be considered in this. So there can be that version of it, or there can just be a denial that your parents are moving into a different stage of life. And I've even heard people who are angry that their parents aren't like basically towing the line. Like, why is she constantly asking me questions? I had a conversation with one person years ago who she said, my mother just asked the same dumb questions over and over again. And she's my mom. I'm supposed to be asking her questions and she's helping me. And I said, I think your mom is having memory issues and she wants to have conversation with you. So she's saying the same things over and over again. And it was like, oh,
mm,
wow, that is what's happening. And the only reason I knew to say that is because I had gone through that with a loved one of my own, And
mhm.
so I think that's another thing is we don't talk about this. We're not sharing resources with each other. And just as it's helpful to hear how someone raised their children, it's also helpful to hear how someone helped their parents in a respectful and God honoring way through their final years of life.
Okay. If people are listening and they're at different stages along the arc of life,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's maybe some are young adults, maybe some
Mm-hmm.
are midlife,
Mm-hmm.
others getting older. So what do you think is maybe one or two practices that you would recommend to help people at different stages age wisely?
Well, I mean, one of the things that really has helped me, and someone was telling me today that there's now an app for this, which makes total sense, is to actually sit down and number. Like, if I live to be 70, how many days have I already lived? How many days do I likely have left? And then just stare that number down. I do things now that I never would have thought to do before. Like, I think to myself, okay, I'm 57. My oldest grandchild, Henry, he turns 5 in November. If I die at 80, that means I have 23 years left. So I will only know Henry until he's 28 years old. I will never know
Mm,
40-year-old Henry. I will never know 60-year-old Henry. And I do the same thing with my kids because I think you can get to the place where you're like, oh, we're just all going to keep going, and
mhm,
I'll get to see the full arc of everyone I love of their lives. And it's just not true. And when you recognize in the same way that like with a young parent, they'll say, oh, I only have 18 years. Well, actually that's a lie. You have their whole lives. But you when you realize that time is precious, you treat time differently. It's just true. And everything around us is trying to get us to fritter time or hoard time. So you've
mm,
got the people who are too busy or the people who are lazy. And both of them are telling a lie about the nature of time. The busy person says there is never enough time. The lazy person says there will always be more time.
mm,
Both of those are wrong. And we see both of those types of time abuse play out in our culture. And so being able to self-diagnose, which one of those am I? And then how can I rightly assess the time that I have? Because if time is limited, you don't want to be the person who's overscheduled. And if time is limited, you also don't want to be the person who just thinks there will always be more. Both presume upon the wisdom of God in placing us as time-bound creatures and having numbered each of our days.
Yeah. Well, Jen, this has been a great conversation. In addition to your book, where can people go to find more of your work?
I mean, I'm on Instagram. I'm on, most of those terrible social media platforms. I try to maintain at least a minimal presence. Or you can go to my website, jenwilkin.net. If you're interested in the Bible literacy and theological literacy conversation in your local church, you can find the work that I'm doing with my colleagues, JT English and Kyle Worley, at trainingthechurch.net.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, for anyone watching or listening, so it's Dust to Dust, Aging Wisely in an Anti-Aging World. Again, it's a good book. I read it, and it is a topic that you just don't see a lot of people talking about. So I'm glad that you did it. So thank you so much, Jen.
Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Theology for the People. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, share it with somebody who you think might benefit from it. And I will be back with new episodes in the weeks and months ahead. At this point in the season, I'm putting out episodes periodically, so make sure you're subscribed on whatever platform you watch or listen on, and that way you'll be notified when new episodes are released. Until next time, God bless you.